The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Hayes as he guided his horse through the canyon pass, the familiar weight of his rifle across his saddle a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked in these borderlands. The year was 1882, and tensions between white settlers and Apache bands had reached a fever pitch after months of raids and retaliations. Sam had been tracking 3 of his missing cattle for the better part of 2 days, following their trail through the rocky terrain that separated his ranch from the town of Cedar Ridge. The acrid smell of smoke reached his nostrils before he saw the devastation. As he crested a small ridge, the scene below made his weathered hands tighten on the reins. A wagon train, or what remained of it, lay scattered across the narrow valley floor, like broken toys discarded by an angry child. The canvas covers had been burned away, leaving only the charred wooden frames standing like skeletal fingers against the desert sky. Sam's horse, a steady mare named Belle, snorted nervously as they approached the wreckage. Bodies lay strewn about the campsite, and Sam could see from the arrow shafts and the manner of destruction that this had been an Apache raid. His jaw clenched as he dismounted, leading Belle carefully through the debris. These weren't the first settlers to meet such a fate in recent months, and they wouldn't be the last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon walls and the distant cry of a circling buzzard. Sam had seen enough death during his years as a cavalry scout to know that whoever had done this was long gone, but his hand still rested on his gun belt as he surveyed the carnage. There would be nothing left to salvage. The Apache had taken what they wanted and burned the rest. As he prepared to mount up and continue his search for the cattle, a sound made him freeze. It was barely audible, a soft whimper that could have been mistaken for the wind, if not for its distinctly human quality. Sam's eyes swept the area more carefully, searching for the source. There, behind the overturned wheel of the lead wagon, he spotted a small figure huddled against the wooden spokes. Moving slowly so as not to startle whatever he'd found, Sam approached with his hands visible and empty. What he discovered made his breath catch in his throat. It was a child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long black hair matted with dirt and tears streaking down her dark face. Her clothing was torn and stained, a mixture of traditional Apache dress and what looked like a settler's calico shirt several sizes too large. The girl's dark eyes were wide with terror as she pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the wagon wheel. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper, but Sam caught enough of the words to understand she was begging him not to hurt her. Despite years of conflict with her people, Sam felt his heart clench at the sight of her obvious distress. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, crouching down to her level and keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." He spoke slowly, using the few Apache words he'd picked up during his scouting days, though his pronunciation was clumsy. The girl's eyes darted between his face and the bodies scattered around the camp, and Sam realized with a sinking feeling that she must have witnessed the entire raid. The question of how she'd come to be here gnawed at him. Had she been traveling with the wagon train when it was attacked, or had she been with the raiding party and somehow been left behind? Either scenario spelled trouble, but looking at her small, frightened face, Sam found he couldn't bring himself to care about the complications her presence might bring. He pulled his water canteen from his belt and held it out to her, maintaining his distance. "Water," he said simply, mimicking the motion of drinking. The girl's eyes fixed on the canteen with desperate hunger, and after a long moment of hesitation, she darted forward, grabbed it, and retreated back to her hiding spot. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and Sam realized she'd probably been hiding here for hours, possibly even since the previous night. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and Sam knew he had a decision to make. He could ride back to Cedar Ridge and report what he'd found, let the territorial authorities deal with the girl, but he also knew what that would mean: questions, suspicion, and likely a one-way trip to the reservation for the child, assuming she survived the journey. As he watched her clutch the water canteen like a lifeline, another image flashed through his mind. His own daughter, Rebecca, who died of fever 3 years earlier, at the age of 7. The same dark hair, though Rebecca's had been brown instead of black. The same small hands, though Rebecca's had been pale as porcelain. The same look of fear and confusion he'd seen in his daughter's eyes during her final days. "What's your name?" he asked gently, though he doubted she'd understand or respond. She just stared at him with those enormous dark eyes, and Sam felt something shift inside his chest. He'd been alone on his ranch for too long, with only the cattle and his memories for company. The loneliness had settled into his bones like arthritis, a constant ache he'd learned to ignore. Standing slowly, Sam made his decision. "Come on then," he said, extending his hand toward her. "Can't leave you out here for the coyotes." The girl shrank back, and Sam sighed, recognizing that gaining her trust would take time. Instead, he moved back to Belle and began preparing his bedroll. If the girl wouldn't come willingly, he'd wait until she was ready. As darkness fell over the canyon, Sam built a small fire using wood from the burned wagons. He shared his jerky and hardtack with the girl, who eventually crept close enough to the warmth to accept the food. She ate like she was starving, which she probably was, and Sam found himself wondering when she'd last had a proper meal. "Ayana," she whispered suddenly, startling him. She pointed to herself and repeated the word. "Ayana." Sam nodded, understanding. It was her name. "Ayana," he repeated carefully, and was rewarded with the first hint of a smile he'd seen from her. "I'm Sam," he said, pointing to himself. "Sam Hayes." She tried to repeat his name, but the sounds came out differently through her accent. Still, it was progress. As the fire crackled between them and the desert night settled around their small camp, Sam realized that everything in his life was about to change. He just hoped he was making the right choice, for both of them. The 2-day journey back to Sam's ranch tested both his patience and his resolve. Ayana rode behind him on Belle, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, flinching at every sudden sound or movement. She spoke little, and when she did, it was in rapid Apache that Sam couldn't fully understand. Her fear was palpable, radiating from her like heat from a forge, and he found himself speaking in low, soothing tones, more to comfort her than to communicate. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across a valley sheltered by red rock formations, with a modest 2-story house built from local stone and timber. Sam had constructed it himself 12 years earlier, when he'd brought his bride, Mary, west from Kansas. The barn and outbuildings showed signs of careful maintenance, though they bore the weathered look of structures that had endured countless desert storms. A small creek ran along the property's eastern border, providing precious water for the cattle and the vegetable garden that Mary had once tended with such pride. As they approached the house, Ayana's grip on Sam's shirt tightened. She whispered something in Apache that sounded like a prayer, her voice barely audible above the creak of leather and the soft thud of Belle's hooves on the packed earth. Sam understood her apprehension. Everything about this place would be foreign to her, from the stone walls to the glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun like watching eyes. "Easy now," Sam murmured, dismounting and turning to help her down. "This is home." The word felt strange on his tongue. For the past 3 years, since Mary and Rebecca's deaths, the ranch had been more of a shelter than a home. Now, looking at it through Ayana's eyes, he saw how empty it must appear, how empty it had been. The girl slid down from Belle's back and immediately pressed herself against the horse's flank, using the mare as a barrier between herself and the unfamiliar surroundings. Her dark eyes darted from the house to the barn to the distant cattle, cataloguing everything with the wariness of a wild creature ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Sam led Belle to the corral, moving slowly and deliberately, aware that Ayana was watching his every move. He unsaddled the horse and gave her a quick rub-down, talking quietly to both the mare and the girl. "Belle here's been with me for 8 years, he said, running his hands along the horse's neck. "Gentle as a lamb, smart as a whip. She's got a good heart, just like—" He paused, the comparison to his deceased daughter dying on his lips. When he finished with Belle, Sam turned to find Ayana standing exactly where he'd left her, but now she was studying the house with intense curiosity. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, and Sam realized she was probably wondering what lay behind those mysterious walls. "Come on," he said gently, picking up his saddlebags. "Let's get you inside, get you cleaned up and fed proper." He started toward the house, pausing when he realized she wasn't following. Ayana remained frozen by the corral, her small fists clenched at her sides. Sam set down his bags and crouched to her level, the way he'd learned to do with spooked horses. "I know it's scary," he said softly. "Everything's different here, but I give you my word. No one's going to hurt you while you're with me." He held out his hand, palm up, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, Ayana took a tentative step forward, then another. She didn't take his hand, but she followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. Once inside, she stopped short, her eyes wide as they took in the unfamiliar interior. The main room was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a kitchen area separated by a wooden counter. Mary's touches were still evident. The colorful quilts she'd made, the wildflowers she'd pressed and framed, the rocking chair where she'd nursed Rebecca. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the windows, and Sam realized with a pang of guilt how neglected the house had become. Ayanna moved like a ghost through the room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She paused at the mantelpiece, studying the daguerreotype of Sam with Mary and baby Rebecca. Her finger traced the glass protecting the image, and she spoke a single word in Apache that Sam didn't recognize. "My family," Sam said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "My wife Mary and my daughter Rebecca." He pointed to each figure in turn. "They died 3 years ago. Fever took them both." He wasn't sure why he was telling her this. She couldn't understand most of what he was saying, but somehow it felt important that she know. Ayanna looked up at him with those enormous dark eyes, and Sam saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or sympathy. She understood loss, even if she couldn't understand his words. "Are you hungry?" Sam asked, miming eating. The girl nodded eagerly, and Sam felt a small smile tug at his lips. At least feeding her was something concrete he could do. He led her to the kitchen and began preparing a simple meal, beans and bacon, cornbread and milk from his cow. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Ayanna watching his every move from her perch on a wooden stool. She seemed fascinated by the cook stove, the glass jars of preserved vegetables, the pump that brought water from the well. When the food was ready, Sam set 2 plates on the small table and gestured for her to sit. Ayanna approached the chair cautiously, as if it might bite her, then perched on the edge like a bird ready to take flight. She stared at the fork Sam placed beside her plate with obvious confusion. "Like this," Sam demonstrated, spearing a piece of bacon with his fork. Ayanna watched intently, then picked up her own fork and attempted to imitate his movements. The bacon slipped off twice before she managed to get it to her mouth, and Sam had to suppress a chuckle at her look of fierce concentration. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against plates and the distant lowing of cattle. When Ayanna had cleaned her plate, eating more than Sam had seen her consume in the past 2 days combined, she sat back with a small sigh of satisfaction. "Better?" Sam asked, and she nodded, offering him another of those tentative smiles. As evening approached, Sam faced his next challenge. Where would she sleep? He couldn't put her in Rebecca's room. That door had remained closed since his daughter's death. His own room felt inappropriate. Finally, he settled on the small room off the kitchen that Mary had used for sewing. It had a window facing east toward the mountains Ayanna's people called home, and somehow that seemed fitting. He found clean sheets and blankets, made up a bed on the narrow cot, and showed Ayanna where she could wash at the basin. She examined the soap with the same careful attention she'd given the fork, sniffing it and rubbing it between her fingers, before tentatively washing her hands and face. When she was settled for the night, Sam lingered in the doorway, struck by how small she looked in the white cotton nightgown that had once belonged to Rebecca. It was too big for her, pooling around her feet and making her appear even more fragile than she already was. "Good night, Ayanna," he said softly. She looked up at him and spoke a phrase in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. Though he couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. It was a thank you. As Sam settled into his own bed that night, he stared at the ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Come morning, he'd have to ride into Cedar Ridge for supplies, and eventually people would ask questions. The territorial authorities would want to know about the wagon train massacre, and they'd want to know about the Apache girl he'd brought home. But as he listened to the soft sound of Ayanna's breathing from the room next door, the first sound of life this house had heard in years, Sam found his resolve strengthening. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he'd face them. For the first time since Mary and Rebecca's deaths, he had a reason to look forward to tomorrow. Outside, the desert night settled around the ranch like a blanket, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. In her small bed, Ayanna stirred and murmured something in her sleep, a word that sounded like father in Apache, though Sam couldn't be sure. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could heal each other's wounds. 3 weeks had passed since Sam brought Ayanna home, and the girl had begun to show signs of settling into ranch life. She followed him everywhere, a small shadow in Rebecca's outgrown dresses that Mary had sewn with such care. Her English was improving daily, though she still mixed Apache words with her halting attempts at conversation. Sam had started calling her Maria, thinking it would be easier for the townsfolk to accept, though she still whispered Ayana when she thought he wasn't listening. The morning Sam decided he could no longer postpone his trip to Cedar Ridge dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the desert sage like scattered diamonds. Maria, as he was training himself to think of her, stood on the porch watching him load supplies into his wagon, her dark eyes filled with worry. You come back?" she asked in her careful English, the words still flavored with her native accent. Sam paused in his loading, struck by the fear in her voice. "I'll be back before supper," he promised, crouching down to her level. "Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch will look in on you, remember? She's bringing her daughter Sarah to play." Maria nodded, but her grip on the porch railing remained tight. Sam understood her fear. In her short life, the departure of adults had often meant violence and loss. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden horse he'd been working on during the long evenings, a skill he'd picked up during his cavalry days. "This is for you," he said, placing it in her small hands. "When you look at it, remember that I'm coming back, always." Her fingers closed around the carving, and she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Sam." The ride to Cedar Ridge took him through familiar territory, past the Thompson spread where smoke rose from the chimney, and along the creek that would soon be lined with cottonwoods in their spring glory. But as the town came into view, Sam felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. Cedar Ridge wasn't a large settlement, maybe 300 souls on a good day, but it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with the usual establishments: Miller's General Store, the Desert Rose Saloon, Doc Henley's office, and the imposing bulk of the territorial courthouse. The livery stable sat at the far end, next to the small wooden church where Reverend Walsh held services every Sunday. Sam had been a regular attendee before Mary's death, but grief had driven him away from both God and community. He tied his wagon outside Miller's store and steeled himself for the inevitable questions. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and penny candy greeted him. Ezra Miller looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Sam Hayes, haven't seen you in a month of Sundays. How's the ranch treating you?" "Well enough," Sam replied, pulling out his list. "Need some supplies if you've got them." As Ezra gathered the items, flour, sugar, coffee, and several yards of calico fabric, Sam became aware of other customers in the store. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stood near the bolt goods, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Sam's appearance. Tom Bradley, who ran the feed store, lounged against the counter with a cup of coffee, clearly in no hurry to leave. "Say, Sam," Tom said, scratching his grey beard, "heard there was some trouble out your way. Apache raid on a wagon train, wasn't it?" Sam's hand stilled on the counter. "Who told you that?" "Cavalry patrol came through last week, said they found the remains about 10 miles from your place. Wondered if you might have seen anything." "Found the site after the fact," Sam said carefully. "Nothing left but burned wagons and—" He let the sentence hang, hoping they'd assume he meant bodies. Mrs. Henderson moved closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say it was Red Wolf's band. Vicious savages, every one of them. The cavalry should hunt them down like the animals they are." Sam's jaw tightened at her words, thinking of Maria's frightened face. "Apache are just people, Mrs. Henderson. They've got families and feelings same as us." The woman's eyes widened in shock. "Samuel Hayes, how can you say such a thing after what they did to poor Rebecca and Mary?" "My family died of fever," Sam interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "Had nothing to do with Apache or anyone else." An uncomfortable silence fell over the store. Ezra cleared his throat and continued gathering Sam's supplies, but Sam could feel the weight of their stares. He'd forgotten how insular Cedar Ridge could be, how quickly opinions hardened into gospel truth. "Well, Mrs. Henderson sniffed, "I suppose living alone out there has made you soft toward their kind. Wait until they come for your cattle, or worse." Sam paid for his supplies without responding, but as he loaded them into his wagon, he heard the whispered conversations starting behind him. By the time he'd finished his errands and stopped at the blacksmith's for some horseshoes, the story had grown legs. "Heard you're getting friendly with the Apache," said Jake Morrison, the blacksmith, as he heated the iron. "That's a dangerous game, Sam." "Not getting friendly with anyone," Sam replied, "just trying to mind my own business." "Business is fine," Jake said, hammer ringing against the anvil. "But a man's got to think about his neighbors too. We've lost 3 families to raids this year. People are scared, and scared people do foolish things." Sam understood the warning. As he prepared to leave town, he stopped at Doc Henley's office, to pick up some medical supplies. The elderly physician had been a friend of Mary's, and Sam hoped he might find a more sympathetic ear. "Sam," Doc Henley said, looking up from his ledger, "good to see you. How are you holding up out there?" "Getting by," Sam replied, then hesitated. "Doc, if someone found a child, hypothetically speaking, an Apache child who'd been abandoned or orphaned, what would be the right thing to do?" Doc Henley's eyes sharpened with interest. "That's a mighty specific hypothetical question, Sam. Are we talking about a child that might need medical attention?" "Just wondering about the legal aspects," Sam said carefully. The doctor leaned back in his chair. "Well, legally, any Apache child found in the territory is supposed to be turned over to the Indian agent for placement on a reservation. But morally," he paused, studying Sam's face, "a child is a child, regardless of blood. If someone were to take in such a child, show them kindness and civilization, well, that might be the Christian thing to do." Sam nodded, feeling a bit of the tension leave his shoulders. "Appreciate the counsel, Doc." As he drove out of town, Sam noticed the stares and whispered conversations that followed his wagon. Word would spread quickly. It always did in a small town. He'd bought fabric and supplies that suggested he wasn't living alone, and people would draw their own conclusions. The sun was setting as he reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Maria ran out to meet him, her face bright with relief, the wooden horse still clutched in her hand. "You came back," she said, throwing her arms around his waist with a trust that made his chest tighten. "Told you I would," he replied, ruffling her hair. "How was your day with Mrs. Patterson?" "Good," Maria said, then frowned. "But Sarah, she asked many questions about my skin, my hair. She say I look like Apache girl." Sam's heart sank. If 8-year-old Sarah Patterson was already asking questions, it wouldn't be long before the whole county knew about Maria. He'd hoped to have more time to prepare, to figure out how to protect her from the prejudice he'd witnessed in town. "What did you tell her?" he asked gently. "I tell her I am Maria Hayes," she said proudly. "I tell her you are my papa now." Despite his worries, Sam smiled. "That's right. You are Maria Hayes and I am your papa." The words felt right, felt true in a way that surprised him. "Come on, let's get these supplies inside and start supper." As they walked toward the house, Sam made a silent vow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever prejudice and hostility they'd face from the townspeople, he'd protect this child who'd brought life back to his empty home. She'd already changed him more than she could know, and he suspected she was just getting started on changing the world around her. The first test would come soon enough. He could feel it in the air, like the charge before a thunderstorm. But tonight they were home and safe, and that was enough. 2 years had passed since Sam first brought Maria home, and the girl had blossomed into a remarkable young woman of 10. Her English was now fluent, though she still carried the musical cadence of her Apache heritage in her voice. She'd grown tall for her age, with the quick grace of someone equally comfortable in both worlds, helping Sam with ranch work in the morning and practicing traditional beadwork in the evenings, skills she'd somehow retained from her earliest years. The transformation in Cedar Ridge's attitude toward her had been gradual but noticeable. What had begun as suspicious whispers had evolved into grudging acceptance, largely due to Maria's own gentle persistence and Sam's unwavering protection. She attended the small schoolhouse 3 days a week, where Miss Eleanor Cartwright had become both teacher and advocate, recognizing the girl's sharp intelligence and eagerness to learn. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sam was in the barn mending harnesses when Maria burst through the doors, her dark eyes bright with excitement. "Papa," she called, using the name that had become natural to both of them. "Riders coming, but not like the others. These are Apache." Sam's hands stilled on the leather straps. In the 2 years since Maria's arrival, there had been occasional Apache presence in the area, but they'd always kept their distance from the ranch. He followed Maria outside and shaded his eyes against the morning sun. 3 riders approached slowly, their horses picking their way carefully along the creek bed. "Do you recognize them?" Sam asked quietly. Maria studied the approaching figures, her expression intense. "The leader? Yes. He is called Nietzsche. He was friend to my father." Her voice carried a note of wonder, as if she were remembering a half-forgotten dream. Sam's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, then stopped. If these men had wanted trouble, they wouldn't be approaching so openly in daylight. Instead, he stood quietly beside Maria, waiting. The 3 Apache warriors drew their horses to a halt about 50 yards from the house. They were clearly assessing the situation, the white man and the Apache girl standing together, the peaceful appearance of the ranch, the cattle grazing in the distance. The leader, a man of perhaps 40 with graying hair and intelligent eyes, raised his hand in greeting. Maria stepped forward and spoke in rapid Apache, her voice carrying across the distance. The conversation that followed was too quick for Sam to follow, but he caught his own name several times, and Maria's Apache name, Ayana, which she rarely used anymore. After several minutes, Maria turned to Sam, her expression serious. "They have come to trade, but the people in town, they are afraid. There was trouble last week near Tucson. Now no one will trade with them. They need supplies, coffee, sugar, blankets. They offer silver and turquoise in return." Sam considered this. Their Apache raids had indeed increased in recent months, driven by desperation as much as anger. The reservation system was failing, and traditional hunting grounds were being claimed by white settlers. But these men didn't look like raiders. They looked like fathers and husbands trying to provide for their families. "Tell them to wait here," Sam said finally. "I'll get some supplies." As Sam gathered goods from his storehouse, he made a decision that would ripple through Cedar Ridge like a stone dropped in still water. When he returned, he didn't just offer basic supplies. He offered something more valuable, his word. "Tell Nietzsche that I will speak to the people in town," he said to Maria. "Tell him that honest trade is better than raiding for everyone. If they want to trade fairly, I'll help them do it." Maria's eyes widened. "Papa, that could be dangerous. The people in town already watch us carefully." "Sometimes doing the right thing is dangerous," Sam replied. "But it's still the right thing." The trade was completed quickly and peacefully. The Apache offered beautiful silver bracelets and turquoise stones in exchange for coffee, sugar, and woolen blankets. As they prepared to leave, Nietzsche spoke directly to Sam in careful English. "You are a good man, Samuel Hayes. You treat our daughter with honor. This we will remember." After the Apache riders disappeared into the desert, Sam and Maria made their way to town. The plan was simple. Sam would approach the town council and propose establishing a formal trading post where Apache bands could come to trade peacefully, with proper oversight and fair prices. Maria would help translate and, more importantly, serve as a bridge between the two cultures. The reaction in Cedar Ridge was explosive. "You want to do what?" Mayor Thompson's face was red with indignation as he stood behind his desk in the courthouse. The other council members, Banker Henderson, storekeeper Miller, and Doc Henley, sat around the table with expressions ranging from shock to thoughtful consideration. "I want to establish a legitimate trading post," Sam repeated calmly. "Give the Apache a legal way to obtain what they need without resorting to raids. Make it safer for everyone." "Safer?" Mrs. Henderson spoke up from her chair by the window. "You want to invite those savages right into our town. They're not savages," Maria said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the room. "They're people who are hungry and desperate. When people are desperate, they do desperate things." The room fell silent. In the 2 years since Maria's arrival, she'd rarely spoken about her Apache heritage so directly. Mayor Thompson studied her with new interest. "And you think you can control them?" he asked Sam. "Make sure they don't cause trouble?" "I think communication is better than confrontation," Sam replied. "Maria here speaks both languages, understands both cultures. She could help prevent misunderstandings that lead to violence." Doc Henley leaned forward. "It's an interesting proposal, Sam, but the territorial government has policies about Indian trade. We'd need proper permits, military oversight." "I've already spoken to Captain Morrison at the fort," Sam said. "He's willing to station a small detachment here if we can establish legitimate trade relations. Says it would be better than chasing raiders all over the territory." The debate continued for over an hour. Mrs. Henderson and Banker Henderson were adamantly opposed, convinced that any Apache presence would bring disaster. Miller was cautiously interested, recognizing the potential for profit. Doc Henley supported the humanitarian aspects, while Mayor Thompson worried about political ramifications. Finally, it was Maria who broke the deadlock. Standing up with a dignity that belied her 10 years, she addressed the room in clear, careful English. "I know you are afraid," she said simply. "I was afraid too when Papa Sam found me, afraid of this different world, these different people. But Papa Sam showed me kindness, and I learned that people are people, no matter what they look like or how they speak." She paused, looking around the room at each face. "My Apache people are afraid too. They don't understand why the white world wants to take everything from them. But if we can show them that there are good people here, people who will treat them fairly, maybe they will choose trade over war." The silence that followed was profound. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed moved by the girl's words. 1-month trial, Mayor Thompson said finally. We'll establish a trading post outside of town with military oversight. If there's any trouble, any at all, we shut it down immediately. Sam nodded. That's fair. As they left the courthouse, Maria slipped her hand into Sam's. Do you think it will work, Papa? Sam squeezed her small hand. I think you just did something remarkable in there. Whether it works or not, you showed those people that fear doesn't have to win. Word of the trading post spread quickly through the territory. Some saw it as a dangerous experiment, others as a chance for peace. But for Sam and Maria, it represented something more. The first step in building bridges between two worlds that had been at war for too long. The real test would come when the Apache bands arrived for the first official trading day. Maria would stand at the center of it all, a young girl who had become something unprecedented, a translator not just of languages, but of hearts and minds. The future of Cedar Ridge, and perhaps the entire territory, might well depend on how successfully she could build those bridges between the two peoples she called her own. The first official trading day dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and crimson. Sam stood beside the newly constructed trading post, a simple but sturdy building erected just outside Cedar Ridge's main boundary, watching Maria arrange goods on the wooden tables with methodical precision. At 12 years old, she moved with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. 3 years had passed since that first experimental trading session, and the monthly gatherings had become an anticipated event that drew Apache bands from across the territory. What had started as Mayor Thompson's reluctant 1-month trial had evolved into something unprecedented, a genuine marketplace where two cultures met in peace. Nervous? Sam asked, noting the careful way Maria positioned each item. Blankets here, coffee and sugar there, metal tools arranged by size and function. Always, she admitted, tucking a strand of long black hair behind her ear. But it's a good nervous. Like standing at the edge of a cliff before diving into deep water. She smiled at him, and Sam marveled again at how much wisdom lived behind those dark eyes. The first riders appeared on the horizon just after sunrise. Sam recognized Naiche leading a group of 15 Apache, including several women and children, a sign of trust that had taken 2 years to develop. Behind them, more groups approached from different directions, representing various bands that had come to see this strange phenomenon of peaceful trade. As the Apache arrived and began setting up their own goods, intricate silver jewelry, beautifully woven baskets and painted pottery, townspeople started gathering at a respectful distance. The early interactions had been tense affairs, with armed soldiers standing between the two groups. Now Captain Morrison's men were present but relaxed, more observers than guards. Maria moved between the groups like a conductor, orchestrating a complex symphony, translating not just words but intentions, concerns, and hopes. When old Mrs. Patterson admired a Apache woman's beadwork, Maria facilitated a conversation about techniques that left both women smiling. When a young Apache warrior seemed suspicious of the scales used to weigh silver, Maria explained the process in his language and invited him to verify the measurements himself. "She's remarkable," came a voice behind Sam. He turned to find Miss Eleanor Cartwright, Maria's teacher, watching the proceedings with obvious pride. "I've never seen a child with such natural diplomatic instincts." "She's had good teachers," Sam replied, then paused as a commotion arose near the main trading table. A new group had arrived, not Apache but white settlers. Sam recognized them as the Brennan family, recent arrivals to the territory, who had purchased land east of town. Jack Brennan's face was hard with anger as he strode toward the trading post, his wife and teenage son trailing behind. "This is an outrage," Brennan shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We came west to get away from savages, not to trade with them like they're civilized folk." The marketplace fell silent. Apache hands moved instinctively toward weapons, while townspeople tensed for trouble. Sam started forward, but Maria was already moving, placing herself directly between Brennan and the Apache traders. "Mr. Brennan," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. I'm Maria Hayes. I believe you know my father, Sam Hayes. He sold you some of your cattle." Brennan's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "You're that Apache girl everyone talks about. Should have known you'd be behind this travesty." "I prefer to think of myself as a Cedar Ridge girl," Maria replied with gentle firmness. "This is my home. These are my neighbors, all of them." She gestured to include both the townspeople and the Apache. "Would you like to see what they're offering? Some of the finest craftsmanship in the territory." I wouldn't buy anything from a savage if I was dying of thirst in the desert, Brennan spat. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Sam saw several Apache warriors tense, their hands moving toward their weapons. The delicate piece that had taken years to build seemed about to shatter in an instant. Then Maria did something that would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for decades to come. She walked calmly to the Apache trading table and picked up a beautiful silver bracelet inlaid with turquoise. Without a word, she approached Mrs. Brennan, who had been standing silently behind her husband. Mrs. Brennan, Maria said gently, I noticed you admiring this piece. It was made by Nalnish. She's a grandmother of 7, and she's been working silver since she was younger than I am now. The turquoise comes from mountains her people consider sacred. When you wear something like this, you're carrying a piece of her story, her history. Mrs. Brennan looked at the bracelet, then at her husband, then back at Maria. Slowly, almost against her will, she reached out and touched the silver work. It's beautiful, she whispered. Sarah, her husband warned. But Mrs. Brennan was already opening her small purse. How much? She asked Maria quietly. The transaction that followed was conducted in near silence, with the entire marketplace watching. As Mrs. Brennan fastened the bracelet around her wrist, her teenage son stepped forward. Ma'am, he said to Maria, I'm sorry about what my father said. It wasn't right. Jack Brennan's face went through several expressions, anger, embarrassment, and finally something that might have been shame. He stood there for a long moment, looking around at the faces watching him, Apache and white alike, all waiting to see what he would do. I spoke in haste, he said finally, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable. I don't apologize for being cautious, but I suppose name-calling isn't called for. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was a start. Naiche stepped forward and spoke in Apache to Maria, who nodded and translated. Naiche says that fear makes people say things they don't mean. He says that courage is learning to see past fear to the person underneath. The trading day continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Word of the incident spread quickly, and people began approaching the Apache traders with new curiosity. By afternoon, the initial goods were nearly sold out, and several townspeople had placed orders for custom work. As the sun began to set and the Apache prepared to leave, Naiche approached Sam and Maria. Speaking in English, he had slowly learned through these trading days. He addressed them both. 3 years ago I come here expecting to find enemies. Instead, I find family. He looked directly at Maria. Little Ayana, who became Maria Hayes, you have done something I thought impossible. You have shown two peoples that they can live in the same world without destroying each other. Maria's eyes glistened with tears. I only did what Papa Sam taught me. I listened with my heart instead of my fear. As the Apache riders disappeared into the desert and the townspeople began cleaning up the trading post, Mayor Thompson approached Sam and Maria. His expression was thoughtful as he watched the last group of riders crest the distant ridge. You know, Sam, when you first proposed this idea, I thought you were either brave or foolish. Turns out you were both. He looked at Maria with genuine respect. And you, young lady, have changed this town in ways I never would have thought possible. There's talk of making you an official territorial translator when you're older. Maria smiled. I'd like that. But for now I'm happy just being Maria Hayes of Cedar Ridge. That evening, as Sam and Maria sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky, Sam reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A lonely rancher and a frightened Apache girl had somehow become a family, and their family had become a bridge between two worlds. Papa, Maria said quietly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day? Sam considered the question. I think about it sometimes, but then I realize it doesn't matter what might have been. What matters is what is, and what will be. What do you think will be? She asked. Sam looked out at the desert where, somewhere in the darkness, Apache families were returning to their camps with goods traded in peace rather than taken in war. He thought about Mrs. Brennan's silver bracelet and young Brennan's apology. He thought about the children in Miss Cartwright's school, who now learned basic Apache words alongside their English lessons. I think, he said finally, that you've already changed this town forever, and I think you're just getting started. Maria leaned against his shoulder, and Sam marveled again at how a single act of compassion, taking in a frightened child, had rippled outward to transform an entire community. The lonely rancher who had rescued an Apache girl had discovered that in the end she had rescued him right back. The desert wind carried the sound of distant coyotes calling to their mates, and somewhere in that vast landscape, two peoples who had been enemies were learning slowly but surely to call each other neighbors. It wasn't perfect peace. It might never be. But it was a beginning, built on the foundation of one girl's courage to stand between two worlds and declare them both her home. As they sat in comfortable silence under the star-filled sky, both Sam and Maria knew that their story had become something larger than themselves. It had become proof that understanding could triumph over fear, that bridges could be built between any two peoples willing to meet in the middle, and that sometimes the smallest actions, rescuing a child, offering kindness to a stranger, refusing to let fear win, could change the world forever.